It's April the 25th, 2019, and I'd like to interrupt my normal monologue to just address the events up in London and around the world, the Extinction Rebellion. So, a huge success, very heartwarming and encouraging. I think everybody should be very proud of what they've achieved. It was an amazing sight to see. But assuming now that people are looking ahead to what to do next, maybe there's a complete battle plan and this is the first step, I don't know. But assuming that people are thinking what to do now, I would like to make a few suggestions. Now, I'm completely unqualified for making suggestions in this area at all. I believe Roger Bellum has a PhD in effective campaign and strategizing. So, yeah, I'm certainly not an authority on anything. I'm an anti-authoritarian, so yeah, take what I say with a pinch of salt. But as a sympathizer, I would like to give my opinion and make some suggestions on what to do next. Now, I know you're very busy and yeah, you probably have to run off and save the planet. So here's the TLDR. I'll just give a brief summary so that you don't have to watch this long video. And if you don't like the ideas, then I can save you a bit of time. So effectively, I would suggest that the next thing should not be a repeat of what has just been done. I think that probably that's as far as you should go about direct action, non-violent direct action in the streets. I think more than this will probably become counterproductive. You probably only got one or two of these left in the barrel of your gun before the average person will be alienated from the movement, and you'll start to aid the right wing and aid the critics of this kind of movement. So I would say get ahead of the game, abandon it, and do the new tactic. So what that new tactic would be is to just bypass your current target, which I think is the politicians, apart from agitprop and raising public awareness. I think really the public is generally aware about climate change, maybe not the severity of the climate emergency, but I think from what I can interpret that you're trying to get to the politicians and try to get over their lethargy. Okay, I have a lot to say on that if I'm correct in that, if that's the assessment. But I'll come back to it. My primary critique about going after the politicians is that the politicians are not leaders, they're followers, and they will follow the public's direction. So yes, this has been a successful campaign in terms of raising awareness. Will that result in some pressure on the politicians? I think only if there's some kind of climate catastrophe or something happens maybe this year that really shocks people. So unless there's a bit of panic, I don't think it will translate to much pressure on politicians. And if it does, it'll just result in tokenism. So it'll result in a token response from the politician. They'll take the path of least action. So there's another reason why not to focus on the politicians, and that's there's too many degrees of separation from them and the outcome you're trying to achieve, which I assume is your stated outcome of net neutral carbon by 2025. So if you have a look at the chain of action, you have to get the public awareness, public pressure affects the politicians have to change policy. That policy then results in reallocation of resources and new legislation, and then that slowly has an effect on behavior of the corporate behavior and behavior of society in general. You're probably on about a 30-year path to achieving your goal, which is way too long for a stated aim of 2025. So you'd have to have much more radical action and a much more effective plan rather than this long degree of separation to your goal. So that's the first criticism. Now, focusing on politicians, I think, is misdirected. You should rather go for the politicians' bosses. The politicians' bosses are the central banks, and the central banks are just an arm of the financial industry and the banksters. The central banks are just put in place to keep the banksters' racket in place. So you should go after the financiers, go after the banksters. Bankers are used to crisis. They're used to radical action on a massive scale. And they could determine an economic outcome that would get carbon net neutrality by 2025. So I would go and target them directly and bypass the politicians. So how you would actually achieve that is a mass action for a debt jubilee. So basically, we're in a debt slavery situation. All the carbon that was emitted was done under the remit of debt. So if you take away the debt system, you will take away the means to create CO2 in the atmosphere. So how you tackle the debt system is by default. So all the debtors would unite to have a unilateral default against creditors, and the creditors are all ultimately either rentiers or financiers. So how that would work is you just take an arbitrary day, for example, November the 5th, say, this year, and you just put all your resources into campaigning for that to be a debt jubilee day. So that would mean that all debtors, public, private, corporate, would all unilaterally default on their debts on November the 5th. Then what they would do is they would take some action, like take the repayments on the debt or principal, any rent they might be paying, write a check and send it to the treasury of the country. So in the US, the IRS, just write a check to the IRS with a cover letter saying this is for climate emergency. And you would do the same in the UK to the Inland Revenue and any other tax collection agency, no matter what country. You would send a letter along with a check saying this is a debt payment because of the climate emergency. This emergency supersedes the authority of the debt. And so therefore you're sending this money to the Treasury. And you would send a corresponding letter to the creditor saying, if you want your money, I've sent it to the creditor, you have to, I've sent it rather to the Treasury, so you have to claim it from them. Now, what would happen is probably the IRS would just say, oh, you have a net credit on your IRS account, and cut you a new check and send you the money back again, in which case you would just rinse and repeat and just carry on repeating ad infinitum. What that would do is probably gum up the financial system to the extent that you could get participation. But I think it's far, far better gumming up the financial system than it is gluing yourself to a truck or a train. So that's the TLDR. Now, if you don't like the idea and you don't want to listen anymore, all I'm going to go in from here on out is into a deep dive into why I think this would work and to give you the details of the probable outcomes and just review the whole strategy. So don't listen any further if you didn't like the initial executive summary. Okay, let's just go over XR's demands because I think they probably need a complete do-over. And let me back that opinion up by telling you what I mean. So taking them from the bottom up, demand number 3, to have these citizen assemblies that guide the government in terms of climate and ecological justice. Now, I would scrap that demand entirely because it just makes you look completely clueless and naive. From a politician's point of view, there are already citizen assemblies for overseeing this kind of thing, and they're called Parliament, Congress, the Senate. There is no way the people in government are going to allow anybody to oversee anything that they do or any of the decisions they make. In terms of a place like America, I'm no constitutional expert, but probably that demand alone amounts to constitutional crisis, if not outright treason. So it's completely unworkable. It's never going to happen, and it just makes the movement look bad. So I would scrap it as naive and clueless. So it needs a lot of work to really think what you mean and what you're trying to say. But to tell the people that you are demanding things from, that you just don't trust them, is an awful negotiating strategy. So yeah, it's scrap that one. Okay, now demand number 2, to be net carbon neutral with greenhouse gases by 2025. Okay, this one too, I understand this is what the science dictates, but this needs some careful thinking, because that again is a very naive ask, and it shows up a massive disjunct in the movement's thinking itself. It also looks extremely naive. It's almost a childish ask, and the reason is that what you're really asking for is a complete deindustrialization by 2025. Yeah, I understand that that is what needs to happen according to the science, but it's a complete non-starter politically. There has to be another route to the same result. So let me give you an example of what I mean. There seems to be a lot of BS going on in the movement in terms of what people's thinking is and where it's at. So take, for example, this one issue that there seems to be a large body of people that I can see that have completely misunderstood what's at issue here, and it really comes down in this demand number 2. So if I'm not wrong, it looks like a lot of people think that we're going to retool society, it's all going to be a Green New Deal, we're going to have all these green technologies, there's a faction that wants 1 million new green tech jobs. All of this is unrealistic. And the reason is the CO2 emissions cannot be halted with green technology. Now, if you think that's being terribly controversial, it's just something you're going to have to look at yourself and work through. But here's the condensed version of what I'm saying, is our entire economy, as it stands today, our debt-based economy, what people call capitalism, is based on a fossil fuel dividend. So that means all the wind turbines that were put up today, all the solar that was put up today, any green technology from geothermal to hydroelectric that you can think of was subsidized by the petrodollar. It was created by the petrodollar and the debt system that is also underpinned by the fossil fuel dividend. So already, even though green tech is coming down in price and becoming more and more affordable, it will always be uneconomical. And the reason is, if you cut out the fuel dividend, if you say create what people seem to be saying, is that you have a, let's say, a renewable dollar. Well, if you built anything like a wind turbine, for example, with renewable dollars, it would absolutely be unaffordable. And the next turbine that you built would also be like a quixotic tilting at wind turbines, because the renewable dollar is a depreciating currency. A petrodollar is an inflationary currency. They can inflate it at will, and that's what central banks have been doing for a long time now, ever since 1971. If you try and build the same economy on a renewable dollar, every dollar that you spend for a new, say, wind turbine or some other generator of new energy, green tech energy, it'll become more and more expensive as you go. So what I mean is, if you have a look at a wind turbine, it's made primarily by fossil fuel products. The wind turbines are about 60% glass fiber. That's made by a greenhouse gas, natural gas, which is another name for methane, and then the epoxy that goes into it is a fossil fuel product that could be done with green tech, but again you'd see that a turbine that was built from a turbine 1 that generated renewable dollars, when they went into turbine 2 to create the next iteration, then it would be twice as expensive or more, because the epoxy would have to come from a new source. The glass fiber in the turbines would have to be melted down with electric. It would be much, much more expensive to take that renewable energy and put it into manufacturing a new turbine. Or the concrete would have to come from a new source that was carbon neutral, which is possible but a big ask. And then all the steel is made by the Bessemer process. It emits about 2 tons of carbon for every ton of steel you get. So that's one of the problems in the thinking of the average member in XR, because they don't seem to realize, as far as I can see, they're not cognizant of this basic reality. And the basic reality is that what people have in their minds, that suddenly now we'll get carbon neutral by building all these new green tech sources of energy, by everybody going out and getting an electric car, by having all these green tech jobs, they're totally counterproductive to the aim of reducing greenhouse gases. The reason is that it's deindustrialization that you actually need to reduce carbon. If you say that everybody runs out and gets a new electric car before 2025, that's a net increase in carbon. There's more manufacturing that would have to go on, there's more steel that would have to be produced for those cars. The green tech jobs, I understand that people need jobs in this current debt-based system to actually get money. The money that's earned from these green tech jobs is not going to be spent in a green way. You are actually increasing carbon emissions by increasing industry. What you need to do is deindustrialize, not industrialize more. And I think a lot of people, particularly in America with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal and the Green New Deal that XR has in certain factions, is that's a net carbon contributor because it's a net industry contributor. And there's no way that you can make that industry carbon neutral as you go. It's an impossible ask. So, yeah, maybe you don't believe me on that score. And yeah, I can imagine the skepticism on that issue. But the simple fact is, let's, cut to the hard, cold facts. This planet only really sustains about 2 billion people. And it really only sustains them living like Amish. And I'm talking about vegetarian Amish. So this is another thing that XR and its members seem to have completely miscalculated. And that's the scope of the problem. The scope of the problem is vast. I can go down to almost any street in America, particularly in the South, and pick out people that would rather die than stop eating meat. If you forced them by fiat to stop consuming meat, life isn't worth living for them. And I mean that quite literally. It's not even hyperbole. So that's the kind of opposition that you're up against. This is a war. This is absolutely a climate war. And it's not like people are going to suddenly see the writing on the wall. A lot of the people are really Christian evangelists. A lot of these people are Pentecostal fundamentalists, and they're looking forward to the rapture. You'll be amazed at the opposition in America. Now, you might take the opinion that, well, this is all about Britain, and we'll worry about America later. Okay, this is the next home truth that people need to start telling themselves. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but in case you don't know it, Britain is entirely irrelevant. If Britain became like Bhutan and it was really carbon negative in terms of emissions, it wouldn't make a blind bit of difference to the world. Now, I understand that people say, well, we have to show that it can be done and take a leadership. Okay, now it's time to get real. And the real politic is this. No one is going to be following Britain's lead, no matter how fantastic their green environment looks. It's time to admit some simple, realpolitik facts. And that is, the fate of humanity is being decided by a dice game, and there are only two players at the table rolling these dice, and that's America and China. It's just the reality of the game. These are some very, very uncomfortable truths about climate change. The first is that of all the CO2 above our heads here in the upper atmosphere, accumulatively about half of that, about 400 million tons, has been produced by the United States. Now, China has produced about half that amount, about 200 million tons. The thing is that China has produced it all in about the last 2 decades. So China has now completely outstripped America as the biggest global greenhouse gas emitter in the world. China's producing about 10.2 million tons of CO2 a year, and America's producing about 5.3 million tons, about half that. Now, the interesting thing is that per capita, China is producing about half what an American produces. So demand number one, that politicians tell the truth. Now, the really inconvenient climate truth that no one wants to talk about is that climate catastrophe is really caused by the fact that the Chinese walrus is trying to clamber out of the water onto the standard of living ice floe that was barely supporting the American walrus. Now understand that the Chinese walrus is 4 times the size of the American walrus. In terms of human population, China has about 1.4 billion people. Now compare that to America of 325 million people. That's a quarter the size. Now America was drowning the world in CO2. And what's been happening is China has been trying to attain the same standard of living or higher. And that's the essence of the problem. Very politically incorrect, but it's just the truth. And unless you face the truth, you can't really ask politicians to tell the truth either. Now you could say, well, China can follow Britain's example. XR will do a fabulous job of leading the way, and Xi Jinping will follow the example, and Beijing will use it as a model to transform themselves. I don't think that's going to happen. And the reason is you have almost zero impact on China. Like it or not, that's just a reality you have to face. If you don't really agree with that statement, then I must take you back and give you a little schooling in 1989 Tiananmen Square. The Chinese government felt no compunction about setting Chinese troops to massacre citizens of China, their own people, and mainly students, young people, in the streets. And that was only just to settle a difference of opinion in how China should develop economically. The Chinese students were saying that China should follow the Western democracy style of development, and the Communist Party took the line that it would be done with state capitalism. And to settle the dispute, they mowed the people down en masse. Now imagine somebody in China standing up for climate change. Not only are we talking about a new direction for development, we're talking about the opposite. We're talking about deindustrialization, scaling back on development. Now, if Tankman disappeared for just having a different opinion on how to develop, you can imagine how quickly and how strongly the Chinese government will clamp down on any activists that try and scale back development. So the problem is really serious. China is creating a new coal-fired power station every single week. The demand for energy in the world is growing so that the IEA says that we should expect by 2030 that the total energy demand in the world will probably exceed 50% over 2005. The demand for energy is growing at the fastest pace that it's ever grown. The idea that this will be done with green tech is absolutely fantasy. It can only be done with a fossil fuel dividend. And that's a reality that you have to face. Now, China did, for a little while, begin a big initiative on sustainability and anti-pollution, green energy sources, but it was just PR. As soon as the world turned its back, it carried on emitting like crazy. So they clearly showed that when it comes to green tech and environmentalism, as opposed to economic growth, they will always sacrifice environmentalism for economic growth. So it's China's economic growth that is going to sink this planet. And that's just simply the reality no one will talk about. But it is the truth. And XR needs to face facts, because your primary demand is that governments tell the truth. You can only start with that kind of demand if the members of XR themselves start telling themselves the truth. And the truth hurts in this case. It's a bitter truth. So the inescapable truth is that 1,000 arrests in London have a zero impact on Xi Jinping and Beijing, and they have zero impact on President Trump and America. So just move ahead to try and have impact on America. I think it's only realistic to say that in the West we can only influence America. Now, people in Britain might say, well, okay, we understand that affecting China and America is a moonshot, but we have to start somewhere, and let's start local. And so then, we might as well start climbing the tree closest to us, or at least we're starting our journey to the moon. Well, that's ludicrous, because no matter how tall that tree is, you will reach the top of the tree and you will have wasted all your time. It's not really a journey to the moon, climbing up to a dead end. And even if you transformed Britain, you would be at a dead-end stake. The citadel to storm is America. China is impregnable. The government has been preparing for eco-terrorism for a long time now, and it's only a matter of time before XR actually treads on one of the landmines that they've set up in preparation for a mass eco-rebellion. Now you might say, well, if the government expects an eco-rebellion and they understand about this imminent climate catastrophe, why aren't they doing anything about it? Well, I suggest that you go home tonight and you sleep on that fact. The way I would characterize it is to think of it like this. The go-to analogy is the Titanic. Now, you're one of the passengers on the Titanic. Liberal Americans and people in Britain have been playing Pokemon Go, and they've been taking selfies and posting them to Instagloat. And while they've been doing all that, the government, up on the bridge deck, they've had all the facts at their fingertips. Now, the Titanic is half full of water, the bow is reeled down, and suddenly all the passengers are waking up to the fact that hitting that iceberg was probably something quite serious. Now, in that situation, ask yourself, why isn't the captain and crew doing something about this emergency? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. And that's that they've done the calculations already. They've looked at the watertight bulkheads, and they've already seen that this ship is not salvageable. They know that there are no other lifeboats. And so all they're doing is managing the panic. It's written over every move they make. Even Theresa May's response to XR was, yes, but why aren't you looking at all the positive things that have been done? You're only spreading fear. And you can clearly see her biggest issue is panic in the population. But let's leave that aside, because that is a big red pill to stomach, and I understand that the average person in XR is not really ready for that yet. So what can be done? Well, let's talk again about attacking the financial system. You have to accept that really, realistically, China is out of the picture. In the West, we cannot really have much influence on China. Except there is one sliver of hope for people that are pre-realists. If you attack the financial system, it will have repercussions in Britain, it'll have repercussions in America, and it will have secondary repercussions in China. It will certainly make the establishment sit up and take notice if you can mount a credible threat to the banksters. Now, as I've said, what a credible threat is to the banksters is going for the jugular, going for the debt-based system. And the obvious way to do that is, because almost everybody is a debt slave, is to have a unilateral cancellation of all debts by debtors. Now let's imagine how that might work out. Let's say that there was a token response. Let's say that the very active and committed members in XR were the only ones to actually do this action of debt cancellation. Now what that would mean is they would probably be punished in the courts legally for default on debt. Now there are a number of things to note here. The first one is that it's a much better use of resources to fight non-payment of debt in court than it is to fight one of these draconian anti-eco-terrorism measures that they've prepared for. Now, if members of an organization wind up in court facing charges that may result in lifetime imprisonment, the organization and the members themselves will have to use resources to fight those lawsuits. It's much easier to fight a non-repayment of debt lawsuit. So if you educate the public, particularly in America, and prepare them to fight legal counteraction in the courts by insisting on a jury and not having any of the streamlined process, you use up a lot of the government's resources and make it difficult for them to fight mass actions. One of the other things to prepare the public for is to educate juries that in America there's something called jury nullification. Now I think it's possible to make a legal case to say that non-payments of debt in favor of climate action is defensible, and any law where somebody is prosecuted for non-repayment of debt can be struck down by a jury in America through jury nullification. So I think it's important to let the public know that there is such a thing as jury nullification. And if somebody is prosecuted for non-repayment of debt because of climate change activism, they can strike down the laws based on debt. That should send absolutely tectonic changes through the legal and financial systems. It would terrify the powers that be if the laws on debt are changed in that way. Now people might say, well, you might induce a financial panic, you might induce a financial collapse, and that would cost jobs, it would cause a lot of misery for a lot of people. And to that I'd say, I think it's time to think of a world where we have to decouple income as remuneration for work and income for survival in the face of climate change catastrophe. So what I mean is, in the world to come, I don't think it's realistic to think that you will get your income and maintain your standard of living from a job. I can't see a scenario where this will all work out, and you certainly won't be able to do it with green jobs. So it's time to look ahead to a complete reworking of the system. And one of the ways to do that is to burn the current system down to the ground and work from there, so that it will be built up in a sustainable way, if that is at all possible. So there's too much lethargy, there's too much inertia in the system. To get the current system and to convert it to a zero emission carbon system by 2025 is utterly ludicrous. It may just be possible to burn the current system down to the ground and to rebuild it in an eco-friendly and environmentally friendly way. Now, why a date like November the 5th works is if you have a good lead time, you have a lot of time for the establishment to panic. The whole financial system works on trust. So if there is a credible erosion of trust, in other words, if it looks like you can achieve your aim of getting a broad mass debt strike on November the 5th, you could panic the establishment into acceding to your demands just to stave off the fact that the action might possibly be successful. So at some stage you have to imagine that there is a tipping point where people would come on board, not even because they agreed entirely with your demands and actions. They would get on board just because they like the sound of debt default. It's very attractive to get out of debt, and you would capitalize on that. Now, it's even possible to cancel the debt strike before November the 5th, if there was dramatic enough movement by the establishment. The effects of that deadline coming up could be dramatic enough, because people just have to say they'll come on board to cause a panic amongst the establishment. Even if they don't realistically intend to carry through with their threat, the threat alone is enough to destabilize markets. And if you can destabilize markets, you'll probably get all the demands you want and much quicker. But I really think you have to rethink those demands. Well, that's my set piece, and I hope I get some responses for this. Any response would be good. I hope I'm not completely ignored, and I look forward to answering any questions. In the meantime, good luck and great job. Keep it up.